So, when exactly did our marriage become a three-person act? I asked, setting my fork down with a quiet clink. The words landed like a hammer, though my voice stayed even. Across the candlelit table, Emma's hand froze over her wine glass. Her fingers, wrapped around the delicate stem, tensed. Just for a second. Then she let out a small breathy laugh, the kind people use when they're buying time. What are you talking about? She took a sip, eyes darting to the side, then back to me, all wide-eyed innocence. I leaned back, slow, resting an arm against the chair. The steak in front of me was cooked to perfection, medium rare, just the way I liked it. Shame I'd lost my appetite. Come on, Emma. You're not stupid and neither am I. You want to try again? A flicker of something crossed her face, guilt maybe? Maybe just annoyance that I wasn't playing dumb. She sighed and set the glass down. Rick, I don't know what you think you know, but Stop, I cut in, my voice quiet but firm. I didn't need volume. I had presence. I've seen the text messages. I know about Preston marks. So don't insult me with a lie. Her mouth opened, then shut. A second of silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, while the restaurant buzzed around us. Businessmen closing deals, couples celebrating anniversaries. Just another night in Atlanta's high-end dining scene. Finally, Emma exhaled, her shoulders sinking just enough to give her away. She didn't ask how I knew. That alone told me everything. She reached for her napkin, folded it carefully, stalling. Then she met my gaze. All right. You want the truth. That would be a nice change of pace. Her lips pressed together. She had this look about her, the same one she'd had when she was balancing the checkbook back in the early days, trying to make numbers work when they just didn't. That same defeated, restless energy. It just happened. I let the words hang. It just happened. Like a flat tire. Like spilled coffee. Not like a conscious decision, not like a choice. She kept talking, filling the silence. I never planned for this, Rick. You were always busy. Always thinking 5 steps ahead, always chasing the next big deal. And me? I felt. She stopped herself, shaking her head. You felt what? I asked, my voice steady. Her fingers twisted the napkin in her lap. Like I didn't matter. Like I was just another part of your empire. Another asset. And then Preston, he saw me. She swallowed. He paid attention. He made me feel I held up a hand. Spare me the poetry. Emma flinched but recovered quick. She straightened her shoulders like she had nothing to be ashamed of. Maybe she actually believed that. I let out a slow breath, keeping my expression unreadable. The old me, the version of myself from 20 years ago, might have flipped the table, caused a scene. But that's not who I was anymore. Rage didn't get results. Strategy did. I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth, slow and deliberate. How long? She hesitated. Rick, how long? She exhaled, glancing down. A few months. I nodded, tapping my fingers against the table. That's funny. Because I checked your credit card statements. The first charge at that boutique hotel downtown? 8 months ago. Her eyes snapped up, wide and exposed. She opened her mouth, then shut it. I chuckled, shaking my head. You know, Emma, for a woman who used to balance every receipt to the penny, you sure got sloppy. Silence. She didn't try to defend herself. Didn't try to apologize, either. And that was the part that stuck. She'd had plenty of chances. Instead, she just stared at me like she wasn't sure which version of me she was dealing with. Finally, she set her napkin beside her plate and folded her hands on the table. So what now? Her voice was steady, but there was tension underneath. That was the question, wasn't it? I could raise hell. Tear her apart. But no. That wasn't how I played the game. Not anymore. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Now? I smiled, small and sharp. Now I handle things my way. And I did not elaborate. The silence that followed was louder than any screaming match could have been. Emma, for once, had nothing to say. I stood, pulling a few crisp hundreds from my wallet and tossing them on the table. More than enough to cover dinner, plus a generous tip. Because unlike some people, I didn't leave loose ends. Before I turned to leave, I met her gaze one last time. Enjoy the rest of your night, Emma. And then I walked out, stepping into the cool Atlanta night, already planning my next move. I stepped out onto Peachtree Street, the Atlanta skyline stretching high above me. The air was crisp, the kind of early spring evening that made people linger on patios with their overpriced cocktails. I had no interest in wasting time. There was work to do. A betrayal to dismantle. Sliding into the back seat of my black S-Class, I gave the driver a simple instruction. Home. The car eased into traffic, the city lights flashing past and reflections on the tinted glass. I wasn't angry. Anger was for men without control. I was already thinking 5 moves ahead. By the time we pulled into the gated driveway of my estate, a property I'd bought long before Emma entered the picture, I had a plan forming. I took the elevator up to my office, the one room in the house that was solely mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, my empire stretching beyond the glass. A heavy mahogany desk, bookshelves stacked with industry manuals and ledgers, framed awards and news articles showcasing my rise. The kind of space built for a man who carved his own destiny. I poured a glass of scotch, let the ice clink against the sides, and sat down. Time to assess the battlefield. Preston Marks. I knew his type before I ever laid eyes on him. The guy who peaked in his early 30s, still coasting on charm, convinced the world owed him something. Ran a boutique marketing firm barely scraping by. Had a habit of taking money from investors, overpromising, underdelivering. A man who built on sand and called it an empire. I opened my laptop and typed his name. It took 2 minutes to pull his business records. Negative cash flow. Lawsuits from former clients. A few unpaid invoices floating in collections. Amateur hour. If he had half a brain, he'd have never touched something that belonged to me. A knock at the door. I didn't look up. Come in. Elle walked in like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. My older sister had been in my corner long before I had anything worth fighting for. She was wearing her usual uniform, black slacks, button-down, no nonsense. She took one look at me and exhaled sharply. So, it's confirmed. I nodded, taking a slow sip of my drink. 8 months. At least. She pulled out the chair across from me, and Saturday, that's longer than I expected. She hit it well. She got comfortable. I set my glass down. They always do. Elle leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. What's the plan? I tapped my fingers against the armrest. Preston's business is already circling the drain. Just needs a little push. She smirked. How much of a push? I clicked through a few more records, checking his biggest clients. One stood out, a logistics company that made up nearly 60% of his revenue. His firm's biggest contract is with Latham Freight. Elle caught on fast. And Latham's already in bed with us. I nodded. A phone call from me, a better deal on the table, and they'll drop him like a bad habit. She smiled, shaking her head. You're ruthless. I shrugged. I'm efficient. We sat in silence for a beat. Elle watched me carefully. And Emma. I exhaled through my nose. She made her choice. Now she lives with it. Elle studied my face, then nodded. All right. Just don't let this consume you. She pushed herself up from the chair. Make your move, then move on. I didn't respond. She was already halfway to the door when she stopped. You need anything? No, I said. I've got everything I need. After she left, I picked up my phone. Scrolled to the contact for Richard Latham. Press call. The man answered on the second ring. Rick. Been a while. Too long, I said. Listen, I've got an offer for you. By the time I hung up, Preston Marks had 1 foot in the grave. He just didn't know it yet. Preston Marks figured it out sooner than I expected. 3 days after my call to Richard Latham, Preston's contract was gone. Just like that. No warning, no negotiation. One moment he was clinging to the only thing keeping his firm afloat, and the next, he was standing in the middle of his half-empty office, staring at the termination notice. I didn't need to be there to know how it played out. I'd seen men crumble before. Some lashed out, some begged, some shut down completely. My guess was Preston went straight to denial. The first sign was the call to Latham's office. He probably assumed it was a misunderstanding, that maybe a competitor had come in with a lower bid. But Latham didn't take his call. Instead, one of his assistants gave Preston the official line, the company is moving in a different direction. The kind of phrase that translated to, you don't matter anymore. Then came the panicked scramble. The emails to old clients, the desperate pitch meetings, the sudden interest in potential investors. But the thing about a man like Preston is that he had built his career on charm, not loyalty. People liked him just fine when he was useful, but they weren't about to throw him a lifeline now that he was drowning. I let him flail for a bit. There was no rush. I was in my office reviewing some quarterly reports when Elle called. I put her on speaker while I skimmed the numbers. Tell me you're enjoying this, she said. I smirked. It's not about enjoyment. It's about balance. Oh, sure. Ruining the guy is just a side effect. I leaned back in my chair. How bad is it? Bad. She sounded amused. His firm's collapsing faster than I thought. A couple of his employees have already jumped ship. He's got creditors breathing down his neck. Word is, he's trying to pull together an emergency loan. I nodded to myself. That was the next step in a man like Preston's downfall, grasping at straws. He won't get it. Nope. I made sure of that. I smiled. Good. She hesitated for a second, then said, "Emma's been calling me." I didn't react. "And?" "She's worried. She won't admit it, but she knows this is you." I glanced at the clock. Emma had always been smart enough to see the writing on the wall, but she was also stubborn. She wouldn't want to believe she had picked a sinking ship. "Not yet. She'll figure it out soon enough." Elle sighed. "Rick, you could just—" "I'm not interested in hearing it," I cut in. He made a move. "Now I'm making mine." She didn't argue. She knew me better than that. That evening I decided to see Preston for myself. Not directly, not yet. I wanted to watch him in the wild, see how he handled himself when things weren't going his way. I had my driver take me to a mid-tier cocktail bar downtown, the kind of place where men like Preston like to pretend they were more important than they were. I walked in and spotted him immediately. He was hunched over the bar, nursing a whiskey he probably couldn't afford anymore. His phone was on the counter, screen lighting up every few minutes. My guess? Unanswered calls. I took a seat in the back, ordered a drink, and watched. Preston ran a hand through his hair, muttering something to the bartender. The guy nodded, probably feeding him some half-hearted reassurance. Preston forced a grin, tried to look relaxed, but the tension was in his shoulders. The kind of tension that came from watching your world shrink around you. Then his phone rang again. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and hesitated. That told me everything. "Emma." I smirked, taking a slow sip of my drink. He didn't answer. Just exhaled sharply, set the phone down, and signaled for another round. Weak. I finished my drink, left a generous tip, and walked out. It was almost too easy. By the time Preston finally answered one of Emma's calls, it was already too late. He had to know that. The way he dragged himself into the cafe the next morning, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, told me everything I needed to know. Emma was already there, seated by the window, stirring a coffee she hadn't touched. I stayed outside, across the street, leaning against my car. I didn't need to hear them to know how this was going to go. Preston would try to act like he had it under control, and Emma, finally realizing the mistake she had made, wouldn't be buying it. Preston sat down, rubbing his hands over his face. Emma leaned in, talking fast. Probably asking questions he didn't have answers to. Why was everything falling apart? What was he going to do? Did he have a plan? I could almost hear the excuses. What she didn't realize, what she never understood, is that men like Preston don't have plans. They float. They coast. They survive by latching onto people who do the hard work for them. And for a while, Emma had been more than happy to be that person. She wasn't anymore. Her face shifted, that last flicker of misplaced hope dying right in front of him. And Preston, realizing she wasn't on his side anymore, leaned back, exhaling sharply, shoulders sinking. There it was. Defeat. I gave it another minute, then walked across the street. The bell above the cafe door jingled as I stepped inside. Preston saw me first, his face draining of color. Emma turned just as I reached their table. Neither of them spoke. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Preston swallowed hard. "Rick." I folded my hands on the table. "Preston." Emma shifted uncomfortably. She had the sense to look embarrassed, at least. I gave her a glance, then turned back to Preston. "I'm here to do you a favor." His brows pulled together. "A favor?" I nodded. "You're finished. You know it. I know it. But I don't need to drag this out any longer than necessary." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do you want?" I leaned forward slightly. "You're going to leave town." Preston blinked. "What?" "You're going to pack up whatever dignity you have left, get in your car, and drive until you're far enough away that I never have to see your face again. You're going to start over somewhere else, do whatever it is guys like you do when the con runs dry. And in exchange, I won't bury you any further than I already have." Preston clenched his jaw. "And if I don't?" I smiled. "Then we find out just how much worse your life can get." Silence stretched across the table. Emma didn't say a word. She wasn't going to save him. Preston looked at her, then at me. He knew he'd already lost. Finally he nodded, just once. "Fine." I stood up, buttoning my jacket. "Good." I tossed a few bills on the table. "Breakfast is on me." Then I walked out, stepping into the crisp morning air, knowing I'd never have to see Preston Marks again. Preston was gone by the end of the week. No goodbyes, no dramatic exits. Just a man slipping out of town with his tail between his legs. A few people asked about him at first, business associates, former clients, but once they saw the way his name made me pause, they stopped asking. That was how it worked. People took cues. They knew who mattered and who didn't. And Preston Marks? He was already forgotten. Emma was still here. She stayed at the house for another few days, like she was waiting for something. An argument. A last-ditch plea. A show of emotion. She got none of it. I barely spoke to her, treating her the way I would a soon-to-be liquidated asset. Cordial but distant. Already written off. She moved through the house like a guest overstaying her welcome. And then, finally, one afternoon, I came home to find her luggage stacked by the door. She was in the kitchen, arms folded, waiting. I set my keys on the counter and leaned against the opposite wall. That everything? Her jaw tightened. Yeah. Good. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. That's it? No fight? No last words. I met her gaze steady. We said everything that mattered the night I found out. Nothing's changed since then. She swallowed, looking down for a second before forcing herself to meet my eyes again. I never meant for things to end like this. I didn't even blink. They ended the moment you made your choice. Her fingers tensed against her arms. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that I meant it, that there was no fixing this. Not now, not ever. After a beat, she nodded to herself. I'll be at my sister's. I didn't respond. She hesitated for a second longer, then turned, grabbed her bags and walked out. I didn't watch her go. Just waited until I heard the door shut behind her. Then poured myself a drink. The house was quiet. It was better that way. The next morning, I got up, got dressed, and went to work like I always did. My assistant, Lauren, handed me my schedule the second I walked in. Meetings, calls, a lunch with a potential investor. Nothing out of the ordinary. Everything squared away? She asked, eyes sharp behind her glasses. She knew what had been happening. Not the details, but enough to read between the lines. Handled, I said, flipping through the agenda. She nodded. Good. And that was it. No awkward questions, no pity. Just business as usual. The way I liked it. Midway through the afternoon, my son called. Michael never called without a reason. He was too much like me for that. I answered, keeping my voice even. Mike. A brief pause. Hey, Dad. I could hear the hesitation, the weight behind his tone. He knew. Maybe from Emma, maybe from Elle. Didn't matter. You need something? I asked, a breath on the other end of the line. Then, I heard about Mom. That right? Yeah. A pause. You okay? The question caught me off guard, but I didn't let it show. I'm fine. Another pause. Good. He hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I always thought she was full of shit. That made me smirk. I raised you right then. He let out a short laugh, low and knowing. Yeah, guess so. We didn't say much after that. We never needed to. But by the time I hung up, I felt something settle. Something that had been off for years. Maybe this was what moving forward felt like. A week passed, then another. The house was quieter, but not empty. I never needed noise. The absence of Emma wasn't something I sat around thinking about. She had been a part of my life, but not the foundation. I was still standing, still running the business, still making deals. The boardroom at Garcia Logistics felt the same as ever. A long mahogany table, windows overlooking the skyline, men in tailored suits waiting for direction. Some of them had been with me for decades. Others were fresh blood, hungry to prove themselves. They all had the same thing in common: they respected results. And results were what I delivered. Elle sat at the far end, arms crossed, watching as I wrapped up negotiations with a supplier. When the meeting ended, she stayed behind while the others filtered out. You look like hell, she said, leaning back in her chair. I smirked. And yet, here I am, still running the show. She gave a slow nod, studying me. You done now? Done with what? All this. Emma's out, Preston's buried, business is fine. So what's next? Or are you going to sit here waiting for someone else to cross you, so you have something to do? I exhaled through my nose, looking out the window. The city stretched out below, a grid of power and movement, deals happening every second. I've spent my whole life building something that lasts, I said, making sure no one could take it away. That hasn't changed. Elle sighed, shaking her head. Rick, you already won. Just try not to act like a man still looking for a fight. I didn't respond to that. She stood up, tapping her knuckles against the table. Think about it, she said, then walked out. That night, I found myself sitting in my office at home, glass of scotch in hand, the city lights glowing beyond the windows. My desk was clean, no unfinished business left to deal with. I had everything I needed. Then the letter arrived. Lauren had left it on my desk, tucked between financial reports. A handwritten envelope, no return address, postmarked from out of state. I opened it without much thought, but as soon as I saw the signature, I paused. It was from an old client, one I hadn't spoken to in years. The words were straightforward, nothing flowery. He wrote to tell me that Preston had tried to ruin me before I even knew about the affair. That he had spread rumors, tried to cut me out of deals. But no one had believed him. Because in business, respect wasn't something you could fake. You either had it or you didn't. And I did. I sat back in my chair, reading the letter twice. Then I folded it, set it down, and finished my drink. Elle was right about one thing. I had already won. There was nothing left to do but move forward. And I wasn't the kind of man who looked back. The ink on the divorce papers dried quicker than Emma probably expected. No drawn-out fights, no bitter legal battles, just signatures and a final transaction. I made sure she got what was fair, but not a penny more. She walked away with enough to start over, but she'd be doing it without my name, my money, or my reputation. That was hers to rebuild if she could. I didn't check where she went. Didn't care. Elle had mentioned in passing that Emma had started working part-time at some boutique, something to find herself. Maybe she would. Maybe she'd spend the rest of her life looking. Either way, it wasn't my concern. Preston was gone. No news, no sightings. Some men scrape their way back, find a way to survive. Others disappear. I figured he'd land somewhere else, try the same game in another city, another industry. But men like him? They never last. Eventually, they run out of luck and out of people willing to believe in them. That was his problem now, not mine. Michael and I met for dinner. Not the strained, obligatory kind we used to have, where he checked his watch between bites, waiting for an excuse to leave. This time, it was different. He picked the place, an old-school steakhouse downtown, the kind of spot where the waiters wore vests and called you sir. He ordered his whiskey neat, just like I did. We talked business, a little about his work, the firm he was climbing his way through. He was good at it, better than I expected. At one point, he set his glass down, rolling it between his fingers. You know, when Mom told me about Preston, she framed it like you were going to explode. I smirked. That what she wanted? He chuckled. I think so. She always said you cared more about the company than the marriage. I nodded, cutting into my steak. That's because the company never cheated on me. Michael barked out a laugh, shaking his head. Fair enough. We ate in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware and low murmur of conversation filling the space between us. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was understanding. A kind of mutual respect that had taken years to build. As we finished up, he leaned back in his chair, studying me. So, what now? Business as usual? I thought about that for a second. Took in the weight of the question. What now? The same thing I had always done. Keep moving forward. Keep building. Keep winning. Something like that, I said, tossing some bills on the table. You sticking around? He smirked. Yeah, I think I will. We shook hands, no sentimentality, no long speeches. Just two men who finally saw each other clearly. That night, I went home, poured myself a drink, and stood by the window. The city stretched out before me, endless and mine for the taking. My empire was intact. My legacy was solid. Everything I had built, everything I had protected, was still here. The past was handled. The future was mine. And that was satisfying as hell.